My story begins with my great-great-great-grandfather, Ole Kittelsen Rod, in Uledalen, Norway. My great-great-great-grandfather was born August 9, 1853, in the Uledalen Valley, which was a beautiful valley surrounded by steep mountains and waterfalls. My great-great-great-grandfather Ole was born on his mother's parents' tenant farm called Rod. This farm was part of the Underbakka farm in Sudal, Rogaland, Norway. This farm was very small, and the farmers who lived here were poor. When Ole was born, he was weak and very sick, and was predicted to have a short life. It was likely his mother, my great-great-great-great-grandmother, did not have enough good food to feed her baby, as they were a very poor family. At this time in Norway, when a family was poor and there wasn't enough food for the family, another family would take in the child and provide for them. Ole lived with his grandparents, so he would have clothes to wear and enough food to eat, and also help them in their old age. In 1877, my great-great-great-grandfather Ole married my great-great-great-grandmother Ingrid. The two were married in Suldal, Rogaland, Norway, when Ole was 23 and Ingrid was 19. Ole and Ingrid had 11 children, but 3 died as infants. For the first 8 years of my great-great-great-grandparents' marriage, they lived with Ingrid's parents on their large farm. My great-great-grandmother Talita was born while living on Ingrid's parents' farm. During these years, Ole worked as a blacksmith in Norway and worked on the farm. There were many reasons for my ancestors to leave their home and immigrate to a new country. The farms in Uledalen were numbered, as they were separated from the main farm. The parents' farm was divided for each child. The farms were quite small, as there were often many children in a family. Aside from the small farms, the crops were filled with rocks, and all of the rocks had to be removed before farming could begin. The Uledalen Valley was very steep, and the mountains around the valley were very tall, so the sun didn't shine on the valley for 22 weeks of the year. These conditions were not ideal for farming, and it took a lot of hard work to provide enough food for families. For these reasons, my ancestors decided to immigrate to the United States. My great-great-great-grandparents' journey to the United States began in 1890. They chose to immigrate to the States because Ole had family in North Dakota. Ole, Ingrid, and my great-great-grandmother Talita, along with her 4 siblings at the time, boarded the ship Cephalonia on April 28, 1890. Ole and Ingrid's families settled in Buxton, North Dakota. When they arrived, they didn't have much money, so they lived with Ole's sister and her husband. Ole then built his family their own house on his sister's farm, and later on moved their house onto their own land. 6 of Ole and Ingrid's 11 children were born in North Dakota. In Canada, between the 1870s and early 1900s, the government was advertising land in the prairie provinces of Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba. The government's goal was to settle the West and increase the country's population. By opening the West to immigrants, Canada's population rapidly increased. My great-great-great-grandparents heard of Canada's Best West and made the decision to move in 1903 when Wilfrid Laurier was the Prime Minister of Canada. In 1904, Ole and Ingrid sold their farm in Buxton, North Dakota, and moved their family to their new land in Saskatchewan, which was about 24 miles southwest of Estevan. Once arriving in Canada, Ole built a house and began farming. Years later, Ole and Ingrid moved to Torquay, Saskatchewan, where they lived the rest of their lives. Ole and Ingrid were active members of the Lutheran Church and organized a congregation for a new church in Salem, Saskatchewan, which was built in 1911. As I mentioned earlier, my great-great-grandmother Talita was born in Norway in 1878. Talita was 11 when she moved to the United States and 23 when her family decided to move to Canada. In Canada, she met my great-great-grandfather Oscar Hansen, whom she married and had 11 children with. My great-great-grandmother Talita faced many challenges in Canada with her children. My great-great-grandfather Oscar Hansen died in 1927 when he was just 48 years old. Oscar worked for a highway construction crew and was murdered for the payroll he carried. This meant that Talita would not have the income from her husband in the dirty 30s, a time of economic depression in Canada, and she would have to finish raising her children alone. Carl Hansen was my great-grandfather and was the son of Oscar and Talita. Carl was born in Torquay, Saskatchewan on January 23, 1917. great-grandfather Carl joined the Canadian Army in Calgary, Alberta. Carl served in World War II for 5 years. World War II occurred from 1939 to 1945. However, my great-grandfather served from 1940 till 1945. During Carl's 5 years in the war, he would serve in England, France, Belgium, Germany, and other European communities. My great-grandfather had a few different positions in the Canadian Army, such as infantry, working in the mechanical sector, and completing special assignments. Throughout the 5 years Carl was fighting in World War II, he exchanged letters with a family friend by the name of Gladys Bode. Through the exchange of letters, Carl and Gladys fell in love. My great-grandfather was discharged from the war in September of 1945 when World War II ended. The war was ended on September 2, 1945 with the surrender of Japan after the bombing of Hiroshima. My great-grandfather Carl Hansen went on to marry my great-grandmother Gladys Bode on December 1, 1945, just 3 months after he was discharged from the Canadian Army. In 1949, they settled in Torquay, Saskatchewan and had 5 children together. My great-grandmother Gladys was born June 7, 1918, and was raised in Fair Lawn, Saskatchewan and Gladmar, Saskatchewan. Because my great-grandmother grew up during the dirty 30s in Canada, her family did not have a lot of money. She wanted to become a teacher but did not have the funds to do so. My great-grandmother overcame this challenge by borrowing money for tuition from her aunt, who was living in Chicago at the time. Gladys successfully completed normal school in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan and graduated with a teaching certificate. My grandpa Keith Hansen was Carl and Gladys's son. My grandpa Keith was born July 18, 1952 and was raised in the community of Torquay, Saskatchewan. My grandpa went on to marry my grandma, Janice Marcotte, who came from a family of French immigrants. My grandparents were married on October 23, 1973. Together they had a farm that was about 45 minutes away from Estevan, located between Torquay and Augur, Saskatchewan. My grandma Janice Hansen was born September 4, 1956 to George and Barbara Marcotte, and she has 7 siblings. My grandparents had 4 children, Jody, Wes, Marty, and Stephen, who all helped them on the farm. My dad was my grandparents' second child, Wes. My dad was born May 30th, 1976, and decided he did not want to be a farmer like the many generations of his family before him. My dad decided to work in Estevan. Years later, my grandparents also moved into Estevan and started their own company. My family no longer farms but now works in the oil field. My parents met one day while my dad was fixing the phone systems in the junior high in Estevan. My mother, Paula Hansen, was a young teacher at the time. My mom, Paula, was born July 5, 1975 to my grandparents, Harvey and Shirley Peters. My mom has lived in Estevan her entire life. My parents were married in Honolulu, Hawaii on December 19, 1998. My parents welcomed me into the world on December 15, 1999 at the St. Joseph's Hospital in Estevan. I have 2 younger siblings, Abby and Caden. My sister Abby is 14 and my brother Caden is 9. I am very thankful for my ancestors who chose to immigrate to Canada. I now understand the many sacrifices they made and challenges they faced. It is not easy moving across the world and living in a new country, especially during a time of world war and economic depression. It is because of my ancestors that I live in the beautiful country of Canada and have a life full of opportunity. I will never forget where I came from and will be forever grateful for my ancestors.